Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first chapter in the book of Colossians. We're going to cover verses 15 through 29. In it, we read of a hymn, an early Christian hymn which would have been sung in liturgical service of the Messiah's supremacy. Then we read some of Paul's original commentary and extrapolation from that hymn, and then we also read of his labors to the church. But before that, we read a customary greeting and introduction, and also a prayer of gratitude. So Paul identifies himself as the author, and the audience he's writing to the saints at the soon-to-be extinct city of Colossus. Colossus was a city that was vanished by a volcano in 62 A.D. Paul did not personally evangelize this city, but he had a concern for it. He had a foot in the door, and the presence of false teachers and heretics was a lot of the motivation. But he never stopped praying for them. We give thanks to the Elohim and Father of our Master Yahshua Messiah, praying always for you. In 1 Thessalonians 5:17, he admonishes the saints to praise without ceasing. And Paul certainly practiced what he preached. He didn't pray for them once. He didn't pray for them when he felt like it. He prayed for them always. An element of perpetuity is there. And he's pleased to hear the rumor and reputation of their good faith and their outstanding witness, and that they are bearing fruit and growing. And Epaphras, we learn in the 7th chapter, was the one who was the one who had converted the city or laid the groundwork. There's no mention of Paul's evangelical overtures to this place in the book of Acts. Nevertheless, he was, and he's also the source of Paul's information about this pleasing positive report. Verse 9, this is also why we, from the day we heard, have not ceased praying for you and asking that you be filled with the knowledge of his will and all wisdom and spiritual understanding, to walk worthily of the Master, pleasing all, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of Elohim. So he explains his motivation and incentive for praying for them without ceasing, always praying always for you, as we read here. And that is, he wants them to have an understanding and a knowledge and an awareness of what his will is for them. So the purpose of prayer is not to dictate our selfish desires to divinity, but for the discernment to know and the courage to act on what his will is for us. And that's what Paul's praying for them here. And we must pray for the same thing, not only for ourselves, but others. We should pray that the entire world has a heart that is inclined towards the will of its maker. And wisdom and spiritual understanding. There is spiritual wisdom, there is carnal wisdom, there is worldly wisdom, but he specifies that he's speaking of spiritual understanding, wisdom of the things of the Spirit, and the things of the Spirit cannot be known apart from the Spirit. Paul communicates in the 2nd chapter of the first epistle to the Corinthians. And he wants them to walk worthily of the namesake, the master of their religion. They are his disciples, ergo they must walk as he walked, lives as he lives, do what he does, and talk as he talks, and to be a pleasing testimony, bearing good fruit. Fruit is just the works that are manifest and spread. They are the evidence of our fruitful ministry. Paul speaks of the fruit of the Spirit. There are 9 of them in Galatians 5:22 through 33. And again, he wants them to increase in the knowledge of Elohim. Elohim is an elusive enigma. We can never claim to understand him fully or totally, nor is it necessary for us to, even if it were possible. But we still should endeavor to have a more thorough, complete knowledge. And he reveals enough, not so much of himself that we cannot live anyway by but faith, and not so little that we don't have hope. Being powered with all power, according to the might and esteem, for all endurance and patience and with joy. So endurance and patience with joy is necessary. He who endures to the end shall be saved. The source of their wisdom is also the source of their empowerment and strength. And he's the one who enables them to endure and to patiently experience the tribulation with a frown on your face, while all else would be sorrowful. The Christian joy is distinct from happiness. Happiness comes and goes. It's fleeting. It's ephemeral. It's there for a moment, especially when you're being immediately gratified. But the Christian joy is not dependent or contingent on circumstances. It transcends all circumstances. Giving thanks to the Father, who has made us fit to share in the inheritance of the saints in the light, who has delivered us from the authority of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of the Son in his love, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sin. So they give thanks. He mentions the Father and the Son. They are a duo and partners and Unitarian essence. They're in one mind, in perfect agreement and harmony, and it is through the Son that we are enabled to partake and claim the inheritance of eternal salvation. This is the blessed hope and expectation of the saints who walk in the light and live in the light. And the one who has the authority of darkness, that is Satan's kingdom, Satan's domain. And before we came to the Messiah, we were dead in sins and trespasses. Then we are transferred through the born-again experience to a newness of life, new outlook on life, new destination awaiting us in eternity. That is the kingdom of the Son of his love, who is tenderly and treasurably beloved. And he is also the access of our redemption through his blood. The blood that was shed on the cross at Calvary has an atoning effect. It was more than a mere martyrdom, but it was sufficient to procure the forgiveness of sins. It is sufficient for the entire world, but is only efficient for those who exercise saving faith in the doctrine. But this speaking of redemption now in the 15th through 17th verse of the Christian hymn, which is not originally Paul's words, but would have been sung in liturgical services, verses 15 through 70 describes his role as creator, and then 18 through 20 describes his role as redeemer. So we often speak of the plan of creation and redemption, and that is fulfilled uniquely in him. So 15th verse, lesson itself. Who is the likeness of the invisible Elohim, the firstborn of creation. This is in reference to the Son, the one who accomplishes our redemption through his blood. He is the likeness or the image. Those two terms are synonymous and virtually identical, certainly interchangeable. And Elohim is an invisible entity, but he was made visible when the Word became flesh and pitched his tents among men, and he exists to give us a revelation and a picture, the fullest, final, most complete, and total form of revelation. He was a visible witness to the invisible creator of all that was visible, we read in Hebrews 11:3. And he is the firstborn of all creation. That does not mean that he is a created being. The term firstborn just means that he is heir to everything. So there's a confusion and a discrepancy, but the contradiction is only apparent between the 15th and 16th verse. Why don't we read the 16th verse so we can explain away the contradiction? Because in him were created all that are in the heavens and all that was on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or rulerships or principalities of authorities. All have been created through him and for them. So if he was a creator, that means he was uncreated. He's coexistent and co-eternal with the Father. He was a collaborator in the creation. This much is communicated in the New Testament, John 1, Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, and the term Elohim in Genesis 1. Elohim is a team, Father, Son, and Spirit. So he was there at the creation. He was in the beginning. He was there before the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Elohim, and the Word was Elohim, John 1:1. And so everything on earth that is visible and invisible, he's speaking of this. He's master and creator and controller both of matter and of spirit. So there is a spiritual dimension. We have spiritual appetites and capacities in a spiritual nature, which are not visible but are intuited through the spiritual senses, which are stimulated by spiritual stimuli. And thrones or rulerships or principalities, these are heavenly and earthly. When everyone who is trust in who it was leader or governor of a people is by his sovereign election and grace. And these rulerships, principalities are roughly interchangeable. And Paul speaks that we wage against principalities and powers in the 6th chapter of Ephesians. But all these have been created through him and for them. So they're created by him, through him, and also for his purpose. He has a purpose and he has a plan for his creation, which is culminated in its redemption. But we got one more verse which describes his role as creator. And he is before all, and in him all hold together. So he was in the beginning, he was before the beginning, he was pre-existent. Before anything else was, he was there. And the act of creation, now on the 7th day of creation, we read that Elohim rested, and that is not entirely, he just rested from creation in the sense that a lawyer rests his case. He still had to maintain and hold it all together from the beginning. Thankfully, he is an indefatigable being, so he didn't rest because he was tired. But the act and process of maintaining the laws of physics in operation from one end of the cosmos to the other is simply beyond the capacity of any being who is less than omnipotent. And he is the head of the body of the assembly, which is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that he might become the one who is first in all. He is the body of the Messiah is a term for the assembly or church, that we are his body, much as the son of Elohim needed a body to minister on earth, so too does the Spirit, his designated successor, needed, and we are that body. And the analogy and metaphor is explained in the greatest detail by Paul in the 12th chapter of the first book of Corinthians. Our body parts, can the hand hear, can the ear feel? All our body parts have designs and functions which they are uniquely capable to perform, much in the same way that each saint has at least one spiritual gift. So we shouldn't send him who is gifted at preaching, to do the singing. If you don't have the singing voice, that doesn't mean you're a sinful person. It just means that that's not your gift. But he is the head. And now any pastor who speaks of their church or their congregation or assembly as their personal possession, stay away from such a one, because it does not belong to them. He is the master of the church, both local and universal, and his eternality is expressed once more, who is in the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. He is the first fruit of the resurrection. Now, many people were resurrected. I think one even in the Old Testament was brought back to life, but Jairus and Lazarus and Paul even resurrected, I forget his name, but in the 20th chapter of Acts, he fell out of a window. But all these resurrected men died eventually. The resurrection he speaks of is the eternal and the heavenly one, the one without beginning and without end. And we partake, he deigns to share some of his eternal nature in the limited way that he can. We are elevated to immortality. Now, the difference between an immortal being and an eternal being is an immortal being lives forever but has a definite date of origin. An eternal being is timeless. He existed before time and he created time. And he is first in all, so that means he is supreme, both in the church and the world, and the spirit world and the matter world, everything else. He is our preeminent concern, and rightly so. Because in him all the completeness was well pleased to dwell. The completeness, alternately translated as fullness, would have been a vocabulary term in the vernacular of the proto-Gnostics that Paul was contending against. Now, the Gnostic movement did not develop into a sophisticated systematic heresy until the 2nd century. Nevertheless, even when the apostles' ministers, there were proto-Gnostics, embryonic Gnostics, they were known as Docetists, I believe, and they were influenced, if not defined, by the Greek philosophical thought that all matter was inherently evil, ergo the incarnation was an illusion. And I think the famed British historian Edward Gibbon puts them in their place the best. He says that they wasted their impotent rage on an empty figment of their imagination on Calvary. So they denied the humanity of the Messiah because it was inconceivable to them that matter could have any positive or virtuous potential, and that was the nature of their hair. And they also spoke of fullness, and also the term mystery. We're going to explain more on what it meant to the Gnostics and what it means to Paul when we get there. And through him to completely restore to grace to all unto himself, whether on earth or on the heavens, having made peace through the blood of his cross. So through him and through him alone, he is the bridge between humanity and divinity. Now within every man, woman, and child, and even in the humblest saint, is the latent longing to be God. We all have a God complex. We want to control our scenarios all around us. But the good thing about us is our God has a human complex. He was able to bridge the otherwise unchasmable abyss between us and him by becoming one of us and dying without sin. And grace is something he can uniquely provide. It is not something we can do or earn. It is the unmerited favor of divinity, and it was accomplished through his cross. And we read in the 14th verse, we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. So that cross was salvifically essential. Without the cross, if there was any other way, that the reconciliation between lost, estranged, alienated, and antagonistic humanity could be brought back to their maker, he wouldn't have went through it all. This concludes the early Christian hymnal. Now these are Paul's original words. And you who were once estranged and enemies in the mind by wicked works, but now he has completely restored to favor. In the 5th chapter of Romans, verse 10, he writes that the Messiah died for us even while we were enemies of him. And in Ephesians 2:1, we already said that we were dead in trespasses and sin. So the world treats us as enemies, and a lot of us didn't think we were enemies of God. We just didn't think he existed, but he made himself known. He is no longer estranged from people who once deliberately and willfully of their own volition estranged themselves from him by just eliminating the concept or the idea out of the picture that there was a God who loves and judges. But because Yahshua is God in the flesh, he is able to restore to grace, the supreme act of grace. Now, love is not what saves us. Grace is, and grace is love that pays a price, and he paid the price in his own blood and writ the code to which we could come to heaven in his own blood. In the body of the flesh through death, to present you sacred and blameless and unreprovable before him. So it was necessary for the Word to inhabit the body, the physical frame of flesh, and to die. His physical body expired. You put nails in his arms and legs. He's going to bleed, and he's going to expire on the cross just like you or I. But through that, he is able to, because he lived without sin, he was born without sin, and he died without sin. He is sacred and blameless and unreprovable. These are three things none of us are, but all of us who are in him can have these qualities imputed to us on our account at the judgment, and that is the supreme act of grace through the suffering. If indeed you continue in the faith founded and steadfast, and have not moved away from the hope of the good news which you heard, which was proclaimed to every creature under the heavens, of which I, Paul, became a servant. There's a lot to digest. We're just going to take it from the top. The need to endure and with patience and joy comes to one's mind. We read that earlier in the faith that was and the not to be moved away. There was heresies floating around. There was false teachers, docetists, proto-Gnostics, whatever you want to call them, that were angel worshippers, were even present in the Colossian assembly, and they were confusing and leading them away. Paul calls them to remain anchored in the good news truth as it is presented to them. And in Galatians 1:8, he says that if even an angel from heaven reveals a different good news message from it, stay away from it. And Paul considered himself a servant. As the chapter unfolds, pretty soon he's going to remind them of his labors for him. So this ceases to be about the Messiah and starts to become more about Paul. That is not to say that Paul did not give all the glory, honor, and praise to Elohim. It's just that he's reminding the Colossian assemblies of his labors and works for him. Who now rejoice in my suffering for you, and fill up in my flesh what is lacking in Messiah's afflictions for the sake of his body, which is the assembly. So he delighted in persecutions, insults, necessities, poverties, and wants, and suffering. He was glad to suffer. He speaks of the fellowship of suffering in Philippians 3:10. Suffering is the supreme act of love, and no more than we should desire to live without love should we expect to live without suffering. Suffering is part of the calling of the Christ, but when we suffer in him, he suffers for us, and we belong to the fellowship of the suffering. And we are connected to the body when we are suffering for, when we are persecuted and imprisoned. That has the effect of spreading the good news beyond its border. Paul was happy that the good news was spread through his chains, as he communicates in the book of Philippians. Of which I became a servant according to the administration of Elohim, which was given to me for you, to fill the word of Yahweh. So even though he was exalted to an apostle was one who had the visible testimony. They were witnesses of the resurrection, and the office died when they did. But the apostles were still servant. The master, when the 12 who walked with him near his death in Luke 22 were quarreling amongst themselves which of them would be the greatest and sit at his right hand and left hand in heaven, he said, this is the way of the Gentiles, but in the church, the leadership is not measured by how many people you have serving you, but how many people you serve. So servant leadership is the paradox of Christian ministry. And it was all according to the word of Yahweh. The word of Yahweh informed his message. It influenced his motives. Everything he did was grounded in the word of Yahweh, and he spoke the word of Yahweh, and he also had it spoken to. Yahweh speaks to people, and he speaks through people, and he certainly spoke to Paul and spoke through Paul. The secret which has been hidden from ages and from generations, but now has been revealed to his saints. The secret, alternately translated as mystery, would have been another one of the terms that was in currency with the Docetists or proto-Gnostics. They taught that the path to salvation was a secret knowledge, whereas the path and plan of salvation is simple. It is not easy, but it is simple to understand. The uneducated are as likely to find it. Lack of education is no barrier to come to a saving knowledge. Lack of culture and sophistication, you do not need to be intellectually superior. And in fact, some of the smartest people in the world are the most atheist people in the world. Satan has blinded the minds of a lot of people, and but what he says is that now the term mystery, when we read that, or secret in this translation in the New Testament, refers to something that was once mysterious, once unknown, but has since been made known. So he's telling them he is revealing it or unveiling it to his saints. To whom Elohim desired to make known what are the riches of the esteem of this secret among the Gentiles, which is Messiah in you, the hope of esteem. So this mystery, it was the will and desire of Elohim to divulge this previously hidden information. They are in the beginning of the new and current and thus far longest dispensation, the dispensation of grace, alternately known as the dispensation of grace. And there was many mysteries that prophets and righteous ones would have envied them had they known what they known. And the mystery pertains to the Gentiles. Now, most of Colossus would have been of Gentile descent, and the Gentiles had long displaced the Jews as the majority of the early Christian movement, and that they were open to and included in the plan and path of salvation. He expounds on this most fully in the 3rd chapter of Ephesians. He kind of references here, but this is the hope of esteem, which is the hope, the expectation of salvation. Whom we announce, warning every man and teaching every man in all wisdom, in order to present every man perfect in Messiah Yahshua. This is Paul's motivation. This is incentive. This is why he does what he does. He announces not himself, but the Son whose return was imminent as far as he was concerned. A lot of the early apostles expected him to return in their own lifetime. But, he could come any day. He could come in this lifetime. Certain things have to come to pass. He's not going to come tomorrow because, the 7-year tribulation hasn't worked its way yet. But we still have to warn, watch, witness, wait, and work for the second coming. And teach everyone in our past, teach them what they need to know to be prepared for his arrival, because that's the day. Even if you live your life before the second coming, you have to know what you know in order to be saved. And so that teaching is an operationally essential ministry for the plan of salvation. Without the dispension and dispersion of knowledge, then no one's going to know the wisdom that truly matters. And perfection, we cannot be. Perfection is, humanly speaking, an impossible illusion. Nevertheless, we are called to perfection at the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:48. Be ye perfect as your Father is in heaven is perfect. So perfection is the standard, one we inevitably and invariably fall short of, but we will be perfected because he is perfect. On our own, we are independently incompetent. We can improve, but we cannot make ourselves perfect. But we can be perfected by the one who is perfect in every way, shape, form, and fashion, and way imaginable. For which I also labor, striving according to the working of him who works in me in power. Paul was not a professional ministry. He certainly was beyond a professional quality minister, but he earned his trade as a tent maker, and this was in the custom and the practice of the Jewish rabbis, who accepted no payment for their service. They all had a side job. They were conditioned to do manual labor. Paul made his way by tent making, but that was also one of the ways he witnessed while he worked. So he did not cease being a minister just because he was making tents. He lived this life. It was all day, and he did it all for them, and he did it all for the one upstairs. And the working of him who works in me in power, Paul recognized that in and of himself that he was not able to go as far as he did, suffer and endure all that he did, but he had a powerful ally working in him, through him, the one who had called him and chosen him. And we must have the same mentality and never be boastful of what we accomplish in his name, because it's ultimately and only about him. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.